Hi, everybody. My name is Jared Milrad. I'm the founder of Movie Karma. We're the nonprofit organization that created our podcast called Rewriting Hollywood, which focuses on diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and social impact in Hollywood, really looking at the power of storytelling and how it could be a force for good and for social change. Today, I'm really excited to introduce a really special guest, Julie Cohen, who's an Academy Award nominated director and producer of RBG. She's done some really incredible work, theatrical documentaries that she's directed, quite a few projects, an Oscar shortlisted project, Julia, some Critics' Choice Award nominee projects, some solo projects, a long list that we'll be hopefully touching on a little bit. But today we're going to be focusing on mostly her latest theatrical documentary called Everybody, which I had a chance to screen. It premiered at Tribeca and will be released by Focus Features on June 30th, 2023. Julie also has a background as a producer for Dateline, NBC, Court TV, and more, and holds bachelor degrees from Colgate and masters from Yale Law School and Columbia Journalism School. So let's dive right in and get to know Julie. Julie, thank you so much for being on the podcast. Great to have you on.
Great to be here.
Absolutely. So we kind of ran through your bio there a little bit. I want to start there, though, before we talk about Everybody, which is a really powerful look at the lives of intersex people. It is revelatory. It's moving. I found it to be, funny at times, troubling, many different aspects of it that I want to get into. But first, we'd like to start, Julie, just a little bit of your background. If you could tell us just, a little bit about your journey. How did you end up as a producer? Like, tell us, was that something you wanted to do, or did you shift courses kind of along the way?
Well, I started out in journalism. That's a background that some doc filmmakers have, but not all. I found it like really good preparation actually for making docs, both in terms of getting into the substance of things, but also the logistics and knowing how to put a story together relatively quickly. When you work at NBC News, like I did, you don't have years to tell a story. You sometimes have a matter of days or even hours. And I think that was pretty good documentary preparation. I left broadcast news about 15 years ago to start taking the storytelling skills that I'd learned and apply them to kind of telling more of the stories I'd say that I personally wanted to tell.
Really, really cool. And that's a good point about having that background in news. So you feel like that prepared you, I mean, really a sense for the pacing, and did it also give you a sense of kind of the investigative work that you incorporate, or were there other skill sets that you feel like apply to what you've been doing
Yeah,
lately?
I think there's all kinds of elements. Certainly, the whole idea of reporting stories, finding who are interesting people that are going to make good central characters in films is something that we did in news that also applies for documentaries. Um, Everything from knowing what makes a strong soundbite to understanding some of the intricacies of post production, which honestly get a little bit more intricate in the
Yeah.
film world than they were in the broadcast news world, but understanding how to deal with a whole lot of people doing a whole lot of different components of the work um, quickly and efficiently was a skill that I picked up at NBC News and have been able, I hope, to continue in my documentary directing life.
Yeah, absolutely. I can see how those would directly translate. So tell us a little bit about your transition to the documentary space. Was that come about, kind of surprisingly, or was this something that grew an interest in?
Yeah, no, it was very intentional. I had always, honestly, I'd always, even at a time when docs weren't the thing that they later became, I had always had really gravitated towards documentaries and had even had the thought sometimes when I was working on a project at Court TV or at Dateline, like, oh, I wish I could tell this in a more documentary way, a way that sort of maybe steps back from the immediate action of the story a little bit, that you get to know the people a little bit more than is how we're going to tell this in the broadcast news world. Maybe you have a little bit less of a template of how the story unfolds. So it was a very intentional decision on my part at a certain point in my NBC career that I decided, like, you know what, I want to step away from this and start my own production company and start making documentaries. I'm not quite sure how it's going to go, but I think I want to give it a try.
Love that. And for folks listening, Julie, who may want to go down that route of telling these types of stories in this type of format, what would you, or could you shed any light on some of those early days, I guess, of trying to make
Yeah.
toxic, like what were some of those
Yeah, so
challenges?
here's it's just this is just the ugly truth of the whole thing. I mean, I almost would recommend people not necessarily take the path. Certainly people that just want to be a documentary filmmaker, that is the stupidest, craziest idea anyone could have. It's not a reasonable way to make a living. When I say I made a decision to step away from NBC News, which I did, that was also with the knowledge that I had worked a substantial period of time to put some savings in the bank because I understood I wasn't going to be making as much money for a bit as I had, in the corporate news world. It was probably, I'd say, a slightly longer period than I expected. I was really busy from the minute I moved into the doc world, but in terms of being able to make a living at it, took a number of years. It's not a very rational, reasonable business that I work in.
Great point, and a good grounding point there for folks. What would you say though were things you learned as you started to find your way, I guess, or I don't know if you feel that way now, but in terms of making it potentially a living or finding it to be more sustainable? Was it the types of projects you were choosing? What insights did you learn there?
I think my main insight for like the early days as a doc filmmaker would be to sort of separate in your mind your creative ambitions from the making a living part of your life. I did projects sort of designed to fulfill each need, but they were not the same projects. I looked at every project I was taking of like, this is something that's going to potentially generate some income, or this is something that I'm going to do creatively. And I did not really try to combine the two things. If it was something that I was doing with the hope that it would make some money, I didn't, like, this doesn't have to be a creative thing. It's just like somebody's willing to pay me to make. I did a lot of public relations videos. I did a lot of web videos that were all totally, reasonable, interesting projects in which I learned some creativity, but I was really just trying to please the client. When it came to the projects that I was doing that were like deep passion projects from my own heart, I went into them understanding like this isn't necessarily something that's going to generate a lot of money, and I know that, and that's why I'm figuring out other ways to make money.
Fair enough. So you're thinking really strategically, which I think is good for people to really take to heart. Um, I want to talk about some of the projects you've chosen before we get to everybody. I mentioned RBG, or director and producer of that, Academy Award nominated.
Along with
Betsy
Betsy
West,
West, who's been my directing partner in a number of the different recent films.
which I want to talk about too, so with Betsy West, and also projects like Gabby Giffords Won't Back Down. Did you are you interested in those types of themes in terms of political themes, or sort of tough folks, like, because I find that documentarians sometimes have themes they go back to. Is that something that was true for you?
Yeah, I mean, the films that Betsy and I have made together are feminist biographies. I would say that was sort of that's our thing. We've done four of them. I think we intend to do some more of them. It's an interest that's close to our hearts, but it's also something that we have some substantive understanding of. I actually got to know Betsy when she was the executive producer of something called the Makers Project that was like really taking a look at the modern women's movement and 100 groundbreaking women. So that kind of raised raised the
Mhm.
thought of, we were telling 5 and 6 minute internet versions of these stories, and the thought that some of them might be appropriate to turn into full feature docs, occurred to us fairly early on, and that's how the RBG came to be. RBG the film, not
Right.
RBG the person.
Not the person, yeah. And I guess just quickly on that collaboration, that partnership. I mean, is that something you would advise to folks to think about? How has that been helpful to you to have that partnership with
Yeah, I
Betsy?
think it really depends. Like, if there's someone that you feel like you can work great with. I mean, in general, coming up with collaborations, whether it's a co-directing partnership or a situation of a, director producer always working together, or editors that you work with frequently. Certainly, I've had a lot of that experience. Cinematographers, like coming up with creative collaborations that feel like they work both on a substantive level, but also on the human being level. Like, you know, life is short. Like, I've been around for a while, so I actually understand what makes what's important in even a work project, and liking the people that you're working with and making going to work a pleasant ongoing experience is really more important than anything. And I think there's a number of roles, certainly editor is one of them, where choices of who you're going to edit a project with, because that's such an intense collaboration, are really are have as much to do with how much I like the person as I do if, like, there can be someone who I think is an editing genius, and like whether if someone I'm working with is like, yeah, I don't really like him that much, then like, it's not happening. So, you know, Betsy and I like each other, and that's part of what has made our work collaboration work.
Yeah, very simple but true. And you're spending so much time together. Obviously, to have a
Yeah.
strong relationship is critical. Let's talk about everybody. Your latest project. Again, it really focuses on the lives of intersex people. I think in ways that we haven't quite seen on screen, which I'm really excited to talk to you about. And it particularly tells the stories of three individuals who've kind of moved from their childhoods, which were marked by shame, secrecy, and non-consensual surgeries, really, to these thriving adulthoods where they're speaking out on the intersex equality and issues around that. I guess first of all, Julie, I'm sure there's a lot you want to cover here, but first of all, like, could you tell us a little about how you found, you know, sort of how this project came to be and what interested you about this topic?
Yeah, well, you know what? We talked earlier about my relationship with NBC News, and this film is very much an outgrowth of that. Um, Even when I left the network news world to start doing docs, I did go back to NBC from time to time and do projects with them. Often it was in the development sphere, where they'd have me come back and look into other potential future stories for them. In 2018, they invited me back to look through their archives and see stories that might make good jumping off points for feature docs. I came across a really interesting story there that has kind of a connection to intersex rights, even though it wasn't specifically an intersex rights story. And it was really through researching that archival story that I started to look into what's been going on with the modern intersex rights movement, how it's blossomed in recent years, and how there's this really fascinating and deeply moving story to tell of people who've been told to keep quiet about their bodies, who are now choosing to speak out very publicly in the hope of advocating for their own human rights and other people's human rights. And like that in and of itself is like a beautiful thing. And just, you know, that led me to some people who are part of that fight. And I decided that making a film about them would be, you know, an enlightening experience, like for me as a filmmaker and a person, and hopefully also for our audiences.
Yeah, it's deeply enlightening. And, you know, I think being Pride Month and, you know, even for folks like myself or in the LGBTQ plus community or identify as queer, I think it's very enlightening if we don't identify as intersection, how to have the experience of that. And these three folks, River, Alicia, and Sean, who you're referring to, I think are particularly great messengers on that point. I guess, could you just level set a little bit, Julie, if you would, for folks who haven't seen the film but might want to, like, what is intersex? Can you just give us a little bit of grounding? And some people might be listening to this and thinking about gender identity versus
Right.
Could you walk us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. These are separate but overlapping issues. So many people know intersex only as, oh, that's maybe what the I stands for in LGBTQIA. Like, so that, like, maybe heard of it, but what does it mean really? Is it trans? Basically, intersex people are people whose biology, their anatomy and or their chromosomes make them not fit squarely into male female boxes. um, their medical records would show that either they were born or over childhood and youth they developed as not 100% male or female. Now there's 35 or 40 medical conditions that fall under the intersex umbrella, so I'm not going to describe like all the ways, but these are biological. This is biological medical you know, variations where people fall outside of, you know, it's not the norm. It's like they fall outside of the myth we've all been told of, like, there are boys, which are this, that, and that. There are girls, which this, that, and that. Of course, like, trans people have known forever that those boxes aren't exactly
Right.
right. And I think many of the rest of us, I mean, honestly, you could, like, most feminists also think like, oh, the box that says exactly what a woman is supposed to
Mm-hmm.
be is not like, that box is wrong. That box is no
Right.
good.
Right.
That box is inaccurate. So, in some ways, intersex people are a super clear example of an argument that a lot of us have been having over many decades. But on another level, intersex people have their own very specific agenda that they're fighting for, and that's basically that they want a stop to being forced into a gender they don't feel comfortable with. Sometimes that's even including non-consensual surgeries. And they want society to be more educated about their variations so that they don't have to go through life feeling like a freak. A phrase that came up with sort of alarming regularity when you talk to intersex people about their early lives.
Right. And we see in the film this sort of long, sordid history with, which I think you document incredibly well, with these, as you said, essentially forced surgeries, which were historically said it, are defined as like corrective, quote unquote, surgeries,
Right.
right? So I guess could you give us a sense, and we don't have a ton of time, but I want to tease this for folks to watch the film, of some of that history and kind of some of the key players in that history of, at least in the United States, of, like you said, I mean, essentially trying to defy nature, because we know this happens. There's intersex experience exists in all of
Right. It's
nature,
a
just
thing.
like the trans experience.
Right, it's a thing. Like
Yeah.
that's the beauty of making a film like this or telling stories like this. Like, because there's been this view that there wasn't a thing, but it's a thing. Yeah. If I could summarize the story, basically, there was a sexologist named Dr. John Money who had a lot to do with early understanding, going back to the 1950s of gender, who basically felt that up until about age 3, a child could be either gender. And so the way to deal with a baby born that didn't fit into either of those boxes was just to basically, quote unquote, turn them into one gender, almost always a girl, and then raise them as a girl without any thought to how what gender the child might actually identify as. And keep the and importantly, often this involved non-consensual surgery. The parents consented, but obviously the child was too young to consent, and secrecy to the extent that often the children themselves didn't know about their own medical histories.
Right. That was stunning that, these folks in the film, many of them talk about going to the doctor, even I think through their teens, where they literally didn't know why they were there, what they were there for.
Right.
Yeah.
And when they don't know where they're there, but meanwhile, the doctor is calling in nurses, residents, and saying, like, look at this, and pointing to the most private parts of their anatomy. Like, that's not a thing that's like, don't do that
Right.
to an 8-year-old, to a 12-year-old. Like, I mean, how people couldn't have understood that this was not an appropriate way to deal with a patient, to treat them as a specimen, is sad. It's changing somewhat, but it needs to change more.
And I guess, Julie, what was your conclusion, or maybe, I don't know if there is a conclusion, but because it's still happening, right? There's still attempts to obviously subjugate, quote unquote, correct folks who are born intersex, and also against trans folks, essentially obsession with their genitalia, with their presentation, right? Like, what do you think that? Well, I guess we're looking through all this research and the history here. Like, what do you think that stems from? Is that sort of specifically American phenomenon or Western phenomenon of kind of an obsession with our genital presentations? Like, what did you come away from thinking the sources of some of this discrimination?
Yeah, I think we have a societal desire to categorize people. I think often when you think a few steps further, you realize that part of the reason we're trying to stick people into categories is so that we can put them into hierarchy. Like, um, and anything that falls outside of the categories as strictly defined becomes confusing and like sort of breaks the whole system of like putting things in categories and then putting the categories in a hierarchy. So so we don't like it, so let's change it, so let's fix it, let's basically like erase it so that it won't be a problem anymore. And unfortunately, a lot of intersex people were really victimized by this thinking, although I think not always in an intentional way. Like, I understand that almost always their parents were acting with the best intention. Often their doctors were even acting with good intentions, but with intentions that hadn't really fully thought through. Would the child really want a whole lot of corrective, not medically necessary surgeries just to quote unquote normalize things? Or might they just be better off if we held off for a while and waited and saw how the child presented, how the child identified on their own?
Right, and we see that with like David Reimer's story. It was a really tragic story in the film around lack of bodily autonomy and how it, I mean, essentially tortured him. I think it seems. I guess on this point of, and I have a few minutes left, but where do you see the movement now for intersex rights and equality? As you said, it's focused really, it seems like at least a part initially on the surgeries, but how would you describe kind of the fight? What are the key fights now of the movement?
I think the biggest fight right now is really for awareness, education, understanding, and kind of like a psychic hugs, like from the love and support. Truthfully, sort of at the first level from the LGBT movement, from whom the intersex people feel like they haven't necessarily gotten the attention and respect and kind of mutual advocacy that they feel that they're due. And then from the larger society. And I think the beautiful thing about this fight, unlike a lot of fights that we're having out there in the world today, is that this is a fight that's really moving in the right direction. And I think in the end, the intersex activists are going to make, like, win is a big word, but I think they're going to make huge gains in the level of understanding of intersex conditions and how they can be treated in a patient-centered and patient-loving way.
Right, and just how essentially that desire for dignity and respect and autonomy around deciding what to do with their own bodies if they choose to at all. I guess quickly, just to close that loop from earlier around gender identity, there was some really interesting points in the film around how some of these activists and advocates say that this, the fight for intersex equality can really support a lot of the fights for trans equity and equality. Could you just talk about that briefly and how that's going?
Yeah, well, I think a really good example is, there are these state laws that are going on everywhere. The one that Ron DeSantis just signed into law in Florida literally has a provision. I'm not quoting it here, but I'm paraphrasing. Has a provision that says, male and female gender are immutable. Characteristics that arise at birth can be seen from the medical records and birth certificates and can never change, and that's like how it is forever and ever, amen. And it's like, intersex people's own medical records the Florida law on that point is really weird because it's not really it's not prescriptive. It's not like we should do something. It's like, this is how it is, but like, it's not how it is. And intersex people's own bodies are the proof that it's not how it is. So there is a real interesting overlap of these two different but very related human rights fights.
Yeah, very much so. And again, nature itself, with I think there's like 1,500 species that have documented homosexuality amongst other queer experiences. So we're not alone. And it seems this fight to try to push back against that reality is pretty stunning. I guess last question in the next 45 seconds. Do you have a hope for this film, really, in terms of what you want the film itself to accomplish when folks go to see it or take away from the film?
Yeah, I hope it really minimizes people's fear. I think one of the most painful things for intersex people is the thought that their bodies are something to be afraid of. When you understand things, you tend to fear them less. And I hope the film promotes understanding and makes people feel kind of ready to learn a little bit more about intersex people, to understand that they exist, and to understand that there are some things that they could do to advocate for them to have the full human rights that we all deserve.
Yeah, I love that. Amen. It's a really powerful film. I hope folks will see it again. It's called Everybody. It's coming out June 30th, right in time for Pride Month, and premiered at the Tribeca Film Festival. Our guest today, Julie Cohen. Julie, thank you so much for being on the podcast and for working on this film. It's really, really powerful, and I hope folks will go see it.
Great to be here. Thanks so much.